The fluorescent lights of Miller's grocery buzzed overhead as Sarah collapsed against the cereal aisle, her pregnant belly pressed against the cold metal shelving. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the eviction notice that had arrived that morning. Her husband's gambling debts had finally caught up with them, and now she had nowhere to go with a baby coming in just 2 months. The store fell silent. Other shoppers pretended not to notice, averting their eyes from her desperation. But one man stepped forward, Marcus Webb, the quiet janitor everyone ignored. He'd worked at the school for 15 years, invisible to most, speaking only when spoken to. What happened next would shatter everything this small town thought they knew about the man who emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors. Because Marcus Webb wasn't just a janitor. 20 years ago, he'd walked away from a life that could have made him one of the wealthiest men in America. But why had he chosen to hide in plain sight for 2 decades, and what was he running from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus moved with purpose through the small crowd that had unconsciously formed around Sarah's breakdown. His work boots made no sound on the linoleum floor, a skill he'd perfected during his years of maintenance work. While others whispered and pointed, he simply knelt beside her. "Ma'am?" His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper. "Are you hurt?" Sarah looked up through her tears, seeing only a middle-aged man in a faded blue uniform with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd seen him around town, but had never really noticed him before. The way people in Millfield never really noticed the help. "I'm fine," she lied, trying to wipe her face with the back of her hand. The eviction notice crumpled in her grip. Marcus noticed the official letterhead immediately. His trained eye, sharpened by years of analyzing corporate documents in another life, caught the lawyer's name at the bottom. Henderson and Associates. He knew that firm. They specialized in aggressive collections for high-interest lenders, the kind of people who preyed on desperation. "Sometimes fine is just another word for drowning," he said quietly, helping her to her feet with surprising gentleness for his calloused hands. The small crowd was dispersing, their entertainment over, but Marcus remained. He guided Sarah to a quiet corner near the pharmacy, away from the prying eyes of Millfield's gossip network. "The baby?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. "Due in 8 weeks," Sarah managed, her voice breaking. "And we're about to be homeless." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. In his previous life, he would have made a few phone calls, transferred some funds, solved the problem with the efficiency of someone accustomed to wielding power. But that life was buried under 20 years of deliberate anonymity. "What's your husband's name?" he asked. "David. David Chen. He has a problem. Gambling." "I thought he'd stopped, but—" She gestured helplessly at the notice. Marcus knew David Chen. He'd cleaned the man's classroom at the high school for 3 years before David moved to the elementary building. A good teacher, popular with students, but Marcus had noticed the telltale signs, the constant checking of his phone, the dark circles under his eyes after long weekends, the way his hands shook sometimes during parent-teacher conferences. "How much do you owe?" $47,000. The number fell from her lips like a death sentence. To Marcus, it was pocket change. In his hidden accounts, spread across various banks under carefully crafted identities, $47,000 was less than he spent on security measures each year. But he couldn't just write a check, not without questions, not without exposing the carefully constructed life that kept him safe from the people who still, after all these years, wanted him dead. "I might know someone who can help," he said finally. Sarah's eyes widened with desperate hope. "Really?" Marcus nodded, already formulating a plan. "But I'll need some time, a few days. Can you hold off the lawyers until then?" I don't know, maybe. They want us out by Friday." It was Tuesday. That gave him 3 days to work a miracle without revealing his true identity. 3 days to help this young woman without undoing 20 years of careful hiding. As Sarah walked away, clutching her shopping basket with slightly more hope than she'd carried in months, Marcus remained in the shadows near the pharmacy. He watched her go, then pulled out an ancient flip phone from his pocket. He had calls to make, favors to call in, and a delicate balance to maintain. What the people of Millfield didn't know was that their invisible janitor had once been on the cover of Forbes magazine, that he'd built an empire, worth billions, before walking away from it all, when the stakes became too high and the enemies too dangerous. Now, for the first time in 20 years, Marcus Webb was about to step out of the shadows. The silence in Marcus's truck felt heavier than the groceries in the back seat. Sarah sat rigid against the passenger door, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Every few seconds, she'd steal a glance at the man who'd rescued her from her public humiliation, trying to reconcile his gentle demeanor with the whispered warnings she'd heard about him since moving to Millbrook 6 months ago. "You don't have to talk," Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "But if you want to tell me where you're staying, I can get you there safely." Sarah's throat constricted. Where was she staying? The question felt like a knife twist. There's a motel on Route 9, the Pine Rest." The words came out barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded without judgment, though she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Everyone in town knew the Pine Rest. It was where people went when they had nowhere else to go. The room smelled of mildew and broken dreams, but it was all she could afford on her dwindling savings. "That's where I thought," he said simply, making a left turn toward the interstate. "Been there long?" 3 weeks. She hadn't meant to answer, but something about his voice made the truth slip out. Maybe 4. The days blend together. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel. Sarah found herself studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the premature grey threading through his dark hair, the way his shoulders carried some invisible weight. He couldn't be much older than 40, but his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much. "The baby," he said carefully. "When are you due?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly. 16 weeks to go, give or take. She'd stopped counting days after the ultrasound appointment, when no one sat in the chair beside her. "That's exciting," Marcus said, and she was surprised to hear genuine warmth in his voice. "Boy or girl?" "I don't know yet. She faltered, realizing she'd been avoiding finding out because she wasn't sure she wanted to make it more real than it already was. "I haven't decided if I want to know." They drove past the old Methodist church, its white steeple catching the late afternoon sun, and Sarah noticed how Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Such a small reaction that she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so intently. "People in town," she said suddenly, then stopped herself. "What about them?" "They talk about you." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "They say you keep to yourself, that you've been here for years but nobody really knows you." Marcus's lips curved into what might have been a smile. Small towns love their mysteries, gives them something to discuss over coffee. "They say other things too." Sarah felt compelled to continue, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because his kindness felt too good to be true, and she'd learned the hard way that things that seemed too good usually were. Such as that you just showed up one day about 5 years ago. No family, no friends, no explanation, just bought that house on Maple Street with cash and barely spoke to anyone for the first 2 years. She paused, studying his reaction. "Some people think you're running from something." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah began to regret her boldness, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Some people would be right. The admission hung between them like a live wire. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or curiosity, she couldn't tell. "Should I be worried?" she asked. "About me?" Marcus glanced at her, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. "No. But there are others in this town you probably should worry about." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, they were pulling into the cracked parking lot of the Pine Rest Motel. The building looked even more depressing in the afternoon light, paint peeling from its siding, half the letters burned out in the neon sign. Marcus shifted into park, but made no move to get out. "Sarah," he said, and she realized it was the first time he'd used her name. "What happened in that store today? That wasn't about groceries." She stared at her hands. "No, it wasn't. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or toward, you don't have to face it alone." Sarah felt tears threatening again. "Why are you being kind to me? You don't even know me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her look up and meet his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be afraid and alone in a place where nothing feels safe anymore." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah clutched the crumpled tissues Marcus had given her, their softness a stark contrast to the harsh reality settling around her shoulders. The store had emptied of gawkers, leaving only the three of them, herself, Marcus and Mrs. Chen behind the register, pretending to organize receipts while obviously listening. "I should go," Sarah whispered, attempting to stand. Her legs betrayed her, trembling like autumn leaves. Marcus remained crouched beside her, his presence somehow both unobtrusive and steadying. "Where's home?" he asked quietly. The simple question nearly broke her again. Home. The word felt foreign, dangerous. "I can't." She pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the subtle curve that would soon be impossible to hide. "He doesn't know yet." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flicker of understanding that made Sarah wonder what shadows lived behind his careful composure. He glanced toward the store's entrance, then back to her with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to watching exits. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," he said. "Neutral ground. Coffee's terrible, but it's quiet this time of day." Sarah found herself nodding before her rational mind could object. Standing slowly, she felt the blood rush back to her feet, pins and needles of sensation that reminded her she was still capable of movement, still capable of choice. Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow with a small paper bag. "Crackers," she explained with maternal efficiency, "for the nausea, ginger ones, my grandmother's remedy." The kindness of strangers. Sarah had always believed it was a myth, something people claimed existed to make themselves feel better about an indifferent world. Yet here she stood surrounded by it. Outside, the October air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of snow. Marcus walked beside her, matching her uncertain pace without comment. His truck sat in the parking lot, an old Ford that had seen better decades, forest green paint faded to the color of sage. "I can walk," Sarah said. "I know." Marcus opened the passenger door anyway. "But you don't have to." The diner occupied a corner lot that time had forgotten, its red vinyl booths and checkerboard floor belonging to a different era. A bell chimed their entrance, and a waitress with kind eyes and tired feet waved them toward a booth by the window. They sat across from each other, an ocean of worn formica between them. Marcus ordered coffee black, Sarah asked for tea, and immediately opened Mrs. Chen's bag of crackers. The first bite settled her stomach more than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said finally. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." Marcus's voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. "Sometimes we all need someone to sit with us while the world stops spinning." Sarah studied his face, searching for the motivation behind his kindness. Men, in her experience, always wanted something, always had an angle. But Marcus seemed content to simply exist in the space across from her, requiring nothing. "I'm pregnant," she said, testing the words aloud. They felt strange, powerful and terrifying in equal measure. I gathered that. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Congratulations, I think." Sarah laughed, a sound caught somewhere between joy and hysteria. "I don't know. I really don't know." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, anchoring herself to its solid heat. "My husband travels for work, a lot, and when he's home—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the growing distance between them, the way David looked through her rather than at her. Marcus said nothing, but his attention felt complete, unhurried. Sarah found herself continuing. "We've been trying for 3 years, doctors, treatments, hope and disappointment, and hope again till I thought it might actually kill me. And now, when everything else is falling apart—" She gestured helplessly at her abdomen, Timing's never convenient for the important stuff, Marcus observed. Life has a way of serving up what we need exactly when we're least prepared for it. Something in his tone suggested personal experience. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What about you? Family? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of tension spreading across Marcus's features before settling back into careful neutrality. Used to, he said simply. The waitress appeared to refill their cups, her presence a brief interruption that somehow emphasized the weight of Marcus's words. When she moved away, Sarah found herself caught in the gravity of his silence. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago." Marcus lifted his coffee, paused, set it down again. "Point is, second chances don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they show up looking exactly like the thing we thought would break us." Outside the window, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, each one catching the light before disappearing against the pavement. Sarah watched them swirl and dance, thinking about timing and kindness and the strange mathematics of human connection. She realized she didn't even know this man's last name. The morning after her encounter at Miller's, Sarah found herself staring at the business card Marcus had given her. The cream-colored paper felt substantial between her fingers, expensive. Hartwell Solutions was embossed in simple black lettering with only a phone number below. No address, no website, no indication of what kind of solutions Marcus actually provided. She'd spent the night researching him online, finding nothing. No social media presence, no business listings, no trace of Marcus Hartwell anywhere in the digital world. For someone living in the 21st century, he was remarkably invisible. A sharp kick from the baby reminded her why she was holding the card in the first place. Her savings account showed a balance that made her stomach clench. $247.83. The hospital bills from her prenatal appointments were already piling up, and she had 4 months left. The temp work she'd been picking up barely covered rent on her studio apartment above the hardware store. Pride warred with desperation as she dialed the number. "Hartwell," his voice answered on the second ring. "It's Sarah, from yesterday. I was hoping you'd call. Are you free this morning? I have something I'd like to show you." An hour later, she found herself walking up the gravel drive to the old Whitmore estate on the hill overlooking town. The Victorian mansion had been empty for as long as Sarah could remember, its Gothic towers and wraparound porches slowly surrendering to ivy and neglect. But as she rounded the final curve, she stopped short. The house was magnificent. Fresh white paint gleamed on the clapboard siding, and the gardens bloomed with late autumn flowers she didn't recognize. Smoke curled from one of the chimneys, and warm light glowed in the windows. Marcus appeared on the front porch, looking perfectly at home in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "You live here?" she asked, still staring. "For now." He gestured for her to follow him around to a smaller building nestled among the oak trees. "I thought you might be interested in this." The carriage house had been converted into a stunning apartment. Hardwood floors gleamed under tall windows that let in streams of golden light. A modern kitchen opened onto a living area with a stone fireplace, and she could see a bedroom and bath beyond. It was 3 times the size of her current place and infinitely more beautiful. "I don't understand," she said. "I need a property manager. Someone to handle maintenance requests, coordinate with contractors, manage the grounds. It's not glamorous work, but it comes with housing." He handed her a folder. "The salary and benefits are outlined there." Sarah opened the folder and nearly dropped it. The salary was more than she'd ever made, and the benefits package included comprehensive health insurance with maternity coverage. "This is too much," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's fair compensation for fair work." She shook her head, backing toward the door. "This is charity. You feel sorry for the pregnant girl who had a breakdown in the grocery store." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those unsettling pale eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. 5 years ago, someone offered me a hand when I needed it most. They didn't do it out of pity. They did it because they saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. They helped me rebuild my life from nothing." He paused. "I'm not offering you charity, Sarah. I'm offering you the same chance someone gave me." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. Beneath the expensive clothes and quiet confidence, she caught a glimpse of something raw, almost vulnerable. "What happened 5 years ago?" she asked. "That's a conversation for another day." He moved to the window, gazing out at the manicured gardens. "The offer stands, but I won't pressure you. Take the folder, think about it. You can let me know tomorrow." As she walked back to town, folder clutched against her chest, Sarah's mind raced. Everything about Marcus Hartwell felt too good to be true, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was genuinely trying to help. The problem was figuring out why. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the black sedan following her at a distance. When she turned onto Main Street, it continued straight, but not before she caught a glimpse of the driver, a woman with short blonde hair and dark sunglasses. Back at her apartment, Sarah spread the job description across her kitchen table. Everything looked legitimate, almost mundane in its normalcy. But as she read through the list of responsibilities, one item made her pause: maintain confidentiality regarding all property operations and resident activities. She thought about Marcus's invisible digital footprint, the mysterious woman in the sedan, and the way he dodged her question about his past. Whatever she was being offered, it was definitely more than just a job. The morning air carried the scent of rain as Sarah made her way down Maple Street, her steps slower than usual. The pregnancy was showing now, a gentle curve beneath her loose sweater that she found herself unconsciously protecting with her hands. Dr. Martinez had assured her everything looked normal at yesterday's appointment, but the weight of unspoken questions still pressed against her chest. She'd barely slept, replaying Marcus's quiet presence in the store 3 days ago. The way he'd appeared without fanfare, helped without expectation, and disappeared just as silently. In a town where everyone's business was common knowledge, his anonymity felt almost supernatural. The bell above Henderson's market chimed as she entered, and Mrs. Henderson looked up from arranging apples with a smile that seemed forced. "Morning, dear. How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." Sarah grabbed a basket, noting how conversations seemed to pause as she walked by. The incident had clearly made its rounds through the town's gossip network. Near the dairy section, she encountered Janet Morrison, whose perfectly styled hair and pressed blouse suggested she dressed specifically for grocery shopping. "Sarah, honey," Janet cooed, blocking the path with her cart. "We were all so worried about you the other day. Pregnancy can be such a trial." Sarah nodded politely, reaching for a carton of milk. "Just a difficult moment. I'm fine now." "Of course you are. Though I have to say, it was quite something seeing Marcus Webb step in like that." Janet's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "I don't think I've ever seen him speak to anyone in town. Been here, what, 2 years now? Lives in that little house on Elm, keeps entirely to himself." The name landed like a small electric shock. Marcus Webb. Finally, a piece of identification for the man who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. "He seems nice enough," Sarah said carefully, hoping Janet would continue. "Oh, I'm sure he is. Just unusual, you know. Pays his bills on time, tends his garden, never bothers anyone. But where did he come from? What does he do for work? Clara at the bank says he makes regular deposits, always cash, but he's never mentioned employment." Janet leaned closer conspiratorially. "Some folks think he might be running from something. You don't just appear in a town like ours without a story." Sarah's grip tightened on the milk carton. "Maybe he just values his privacy." "Maybe." Janet's tone suggested she found this explanation insufficient. "Though I did hear something interesting from my sister-in-law. She works at the hospital over in Millfield. Says they had a patient last month, some homeless veteran who'd been beaten pretty badly. When they went to discharge him, all his medical bills had been paid anonymously. Cash payment, hand-delivered by a quiet man who wouldn't give his name." The information settled strangely in Sarah's mind. She thought of Marcus's gentle hands, The way he'd moved with such careful consideration, it wasn't difficult to imagine him performing anonymous acts of kindness. "Could be coincidence," she murmured. "Could be. Or maybe our mysterious neighbor is more interesting than he appears." Janet straightened, apparently satisfied with her intelligence gathering. "Well, I should let you finish your shopping. Take care of yourself, dear." As Janet wheeled away, Sarah found herself staring unseeing at the dairy display. Marcus Webb. The name felt significant somehow, though she couldn't place why. She continued through the store mechanically, her mind churning with questions. At the checkout counter, old Pete Henderson rang up her items with unusual focus, avoiding eye contact. Finally, as he bagged her groceries, he spoke quietly. "That man who helped you the other day, good fellow." Sarah looked up, surprised. "You know him?" "Know of him. Comes in sometimes, usually early morning or late evening when it's quiet. Always polite, pays cash, minds his business." Pete's weathered hands paused in their work. "But I've noticed things, little things. Sometimes items go missing from my day-old shelf. Bread, produce that's getting soft. Nothing expensive, nothing I'd really miss. But it happens regular-like. You think he's stealing?" Pete's laugh was dry. "Opposite. Found an envelope under my door last week, cash inside, more than enough to cover anything that might have walked out. No note, no explanation, just payment for what wasn't technically bought." The picture Janet had painted gained another layer, a man who helped veterans anonymously and left money for food he'd given away. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you looked at him different than most folks do. They see mystery and get suspicious. You saw kindness." Pete handed her the bags. "In my experience, the people trying hardest to disappear usually have the best reasons. And the ones who keep helping others despite their own troubles, those are the ones worth knowing." Outside, Sarah sat in her car longer than necessary, processing the morning's revelations. Marcus Webb was becoming less mystery and more puzzle, a man whose actions spoke of deep compassion wrapped in deliberate isolation. The question that haunted her wasn't who he was hiding from, but what had happened to make hiding necessary, and why, despite barely knowing him, did she feel compelled to find out. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah stared at the pregnancy test results spread across her kitchen table like tarot cards predicting an uncertain future. 3 positive tests couldn't be wrong, but the timing couldn't be worse. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to ease the throbbing that had started the moment she'd seen those 2 pink lines. Marcus had been gone for 6 months now, chasing some business opportunity in Denver that had turned into radio silence. The last text she'd received was 3 weeks ago, need more time to figure things out. She'd stopped responding after that, her pride finally overriding her desperation to salvage what remained of their 5-year relationship. The baby would be due in late spring, she calculated. By then, the last of her savings would be gone, and her job at the library barely covered rent and groceries. She thought of her mother, who'd raised 3 children alone after their father disappeared one ordinary Tuesday morning, leaving nothing but empty hangers in the closet and a note about needing to find himself. History had a cruel way of repeating itself. Sarah gathered the tests and wrapped them in tissue paper, shoving them deep into the trash can beneath coffee grounds and yesterday's mail. Tomorrow she would call Dr. Reeves and make an appointment, but tonight she needed to pretend this wasn't happening, at least for a few more hours. She pulled on her jacket and grabbed her purse. The grocery store would be nearly empty at this hour, and she needed milk for tomorrow's breakfast. Normal tasks, normal routines, these were the anchors that kept her from drifting into the panic that lurked at the edges of her consciousness. The automatic doors of Patterson's Market whooshed open, releasing a burst of conditioned air into the humid evening. Sarah grabbed a cart, its wheels squeaking in protest as she made her way toward the dairy section. The store felt cavernous at night, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the aisles. She was reaching for a gallon of milk when the nausea hit like a freight train. The carton slipped from her fingers, exploding against the floor in a shower of white. The smell, sweet and somehow wrong, triggered something primal in her stomach. She barely made it to the nearby trash can before retching, her body betraying the secret she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The voice was quiet, concerned. Sarah looked up through watery eyes to see a man crouched beside her, his weathered hands offering a packet of tissues. She recognized him vaguely. He lived somewhere on the outskirts of town, kept to himself, always paid in cash. Thomas something. Thompson? Thomas? "I'm fine," she managed, accepting the tissues gratefully. "Just a stomach bug." Thomas didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he helped her to a nearby bench positioned between the pharmacy and the greeting cards, then disappeared without a word. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on breathing, trying to calm her racing heart. When she opened them again, Thomas had returned with a bottle of ginger ale and a small package of crackers. He set them beside her with the same careful attention she'd seen him pay to his weekly shopping, methodical, thoughtful, never rushed. "Ginger helps," he said simply. There was something in his voice, a gentleness that caught her off guard. Most people in Millbrook were friendly enough, but there was always an undercurrent of curiosity, especially with someone like her, young, unmarried, relatively new to town. Thomas asked no questions, made no assumptions. He simply waited while she sipped the ginger ale and nibbled a cracker. "Thank you," she said finally. "I should go home." "I can drive you," he offered. "Your car can stay here tonight." Sarah started to protest, then realized she was in no condition to drive. Her hands were still shaking, and the fluorescent light seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. She nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. His truck was older but immaculately maintained, the bench seat covered with a worn blanket that smelled faintly of pine needles. They drove in comfortable silence through the empty streets, past the courthouse with its clock tower frozen at 9:47, past the diner where teenagers gathered after football games, past the library where she would return tomorrow and pretend everything was normal. When they reached her small rental house, Thomas walked her to the door but didn't linger. "Take care of yourself," he said, and there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if he knew more than he was saying. Sarah watched his taillights disappear around the corner before going inside. She left the ginger ale and crackers on the counter, tangible proof that kindness still existed in a world that suddenly felt overwhelming and uncertain. For the first time in hours, the panic receded just enough for her to breathe. The morning light filtered through Sarah's kitchen window as she stared at the business card Marcus had given her. Dr. Elena Vasquez, licensed clinical social worker. The embossed letters seemed to shimmer against the cream-colored cardstock, and Sarah wondered how many other desperate people had held this same card, hoping for salvation. She'd barely slept after Marcus left. Every creak of the old house made her jump, every shadow in the hallway looked like David returning home early from his trip. The rational part of her mind knew he wouldn't be back for 3 days, but fear had a way of making time elastic, turning hours into potential ambushes. The baby kicked, a gentle reminder that she wasn't making decisions just for herself anymore. Sarah pressed her palm against her belly and closed her eyes, trying to summon the courage that had seemed so accessible when Marcus was sitting across from her, his steady presence making everything feel possible. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "Hope you're feeling better. Bring something nice back from Portland. Love you." The words made her stomach clench. Even from 200 miles away, he was checking in, maintaining control. She wondered if he'd called the neighbors, asked them to keep an eye on her. Mrs. Henderson next door was always eager to please David, always complimenting him on his beautiful wife and well-maintained yard. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card before she could change her mind. "Dr. Vasquez speaking. Hi, someone gave me your card. Marcus Chen? He said you might be able to help me." There was a pause, and Sarah heard the sound of papers shuffling. "Of course. Sarah, right? Marcus mentioned you might call. Are you available this afternoon? I have a cancellation at 2 o'clock. The speed of it caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected weeks of waiting, bureaucratic hurdles. Yes, I think so. My office is in the professional building on Maple Street, Suite 204. And Sarah, you're taking the right step. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the growing morning light and tried to imagine what she would say. How did you explain to a stranger that your life was a carefully constructed lie? That the man everyone admired was slowly erasing you, piece by piece, until you weren't sure what parts of yourself remained? She thought about Marcus, wondering what had prompted him to carry that card around. Did he make a habit of rescuing broken people, or had something in her desperation spoken to him specifically? There was something about his careful way of speaking that suggested he understood damage from the inside out. At 11:30, Sarah drove to the grocery store. She told herself she needed milk and bread, but really she was hoping to see Marcus again, to anchor herself in his quiet certainty before the afternoon appointment that felt both terrifying and essential. She found him in aisle 3, restocking cereal boxes with methodical precision. When he saw her, he paused, a box of cornflakes suspended in his hands. "I called her," Sarah said without preamble. "Dr. Vasquez, I have an appointment this afternoon." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a subtle relaxation around his eyes. "Good. That's good, Sarah. I don't know what I'm going to say to her. You'll know when you get there." He placed the cereal box on the shelf and turned to face her fully. "The hardest part is showing up. Did someone help you once?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. Too personal for a grocery store aisle, too intimate for people who barely knew each other. Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah started to apologize, but then he nodded slowly. Different situation. Same feeling of being trapped. He picked up another box, his movements careful and deliberate. "Someone threw me a rope when I needed it most. Sometimes that's all it takes." "What if he finds out?" "About the appointment? Are you going to tell him?" "No. Then he won't know unless you want him to know." There was something reassuring about Marcus's certainty, the way he spoke as if keeping secrets from David was not only possible but reasonable. Sarah realized she'd become so accustomed to David's omnipresence in her life that the idea of having private experiences felt revolutionary. "Thank you," she said, "for the card, for listening. I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." Marcus's smile was small but genuine. "Everyone deserves to be safe, Sarah, especially with a baby coming." Walking back to her car, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile, tentative, but real. The afternoon stretched ahead of her like an open door, and for the first time in years, she was curious about what lay beyond the threshold. At 1:45, she sat in her car outside Dr. Vasquez's office building, watching other people walk purposefully to their destinations. Soon, she would be one of them. The morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret's kitchen as she sat staring at the letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The return address bore the seal of the county prosecutor's office, and she'd read it so many times the creases were beginning to wear thin. They wanted her to testify about what she'd witnessed that night 15 years ago, the night everyone agreed never to speak of again. Her coffee had grown cold, but she didn't notice. Outside, she could see Thomas walking past her fence line, heading toward the old Miller property with his measured, purposeful stride. Even from this distance, she could sense the weight he carried, the same weight they all carried but somehow managed to distribute among themselves like shares in a terrible company. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Sheriff Coleman's voice was tight with strain. "Margaret, we need to talk. All of us. The pressure's mounting, and I've got reporters starting to ask questions about things they shouldn't even know exist." "Where?" she asked, though she already knew. "The usual place. Tonight, after the diner closes." Margaret hung up and immediately dialed 3 more numbers. The conversations were brief, coded in the language of people who'd kept secrets for so long they'd forgotten how to speak freely. By evening, they would all gather in the back room of Coleman's diner, just as they had every few months for the past 15 years whenever the past threatened to surface. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Chen was discovering that pregnancy had given her an unexpected superpower, the ability to sense dishonesty with startling clarity. It might have been the hormones, or perhaps the vulnerability of carrying new life had stripped away her tolerance for pretense, but everywhere she looked, she saw the careful choreography of a community hiding something. Dr. Patterson's gentle questions during her appointment that morning hadn't felt like routine prenatal care. They'd probed around the edges of her well-being with the precision of someone checking for cracks in a foundation. Mrs. Henderson at the post office had stammered when Sarah mentioned how kind everyone had been since her breakdown at the grocery store, as if kindness itself was somehow suspicious. Most telling of all was the way people's eyes shifted when she mentioned Thomas, not with the usual small-town curiosity about an outsider, but with something approaching reverence mixed with fear. That afternoon, she found herself walking past the old Miller property, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. The house sat empty, its windows dark, but the garden was immaculate. Someone was tending it with religious devotion, and she suspected she knew who. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah spun around to find Thomas emerging from the tree line, a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Up close, she could see that his eyes held flecks of gold that seemed to shift in the dappled sunlight. "Are you the one taking care of it?" she asked. He nodded, moving to deadhead some roses with practiced efficiency. "The family asked me to keep it up before they moved away. That was years ago, but I never stopped." There was something in the way he said "moved away" that suggested they hadn't left by choice. Sarah watched his careful movements among the flowers, noting how his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "Thomas," she said carefully, "what really happened in this town? Everyone treats me like I'm made of spun glass, and I can't shake the feeling it has nothing to do with my pregnancy." He stilled, a half-opened rosebud cradled in his palm. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of insects and the whisper of wind through the leaves. "Sometimes," he said finally, "a town makes choices that define it forever. The people here aren't bad, Sarah. They're just carrying something heavy, and they've learned that the weight is easier to bear when shared. And you? Are you carrying it too?" Thomas looked at her then with such profound sadness that she instinctively reached out to touch his arm. The contact seemed to anchor him, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "I carry something different," he said, "but related. Everything here is related, like ripples in a pond." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the sound of car doors slamming drew their attention. Sheriff Coleman was pulling into the driveway of the empty house, followed by Margaret's familiar sedan. Both vehicles sat idling, their occupants clearly waiting for something. Thomas cursed softly under his breath, the first time Sarah had heard him use anything stronger than darn. "You should go home," he said urgently. "Tonight isn't a good night for questions." As if summoned by his words, Dr. Patterson's truck rounded the corner, followed by two other vehicles Sarah recognized but couldn't place. Whatever was happening, it involved half the town's leadership. "Thomas," she started, but he was already moving toward the house, his earlier gentleness replaced by grim determination. "Go home, Sarah. Lock your doors. Some stones are better left unturned." But as she walked away, Sarah Chen made a decision that would change everything. Some stones, she realized, demanded to be lifted, especially when they'd been sitting on the truth for 15 years. The sheriff's office felt smaller than usual as Sarah sat across from Deputy Martinez, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look bleached and unforgiving. She'd been here for 3 hours, answering the same questions in different ways, watching Martinez scribble notes that probably said more about her mental state than the actual facts. "Let's go through it one more time," Martinez said, his voice patient but tired. "You're certain the person you saw matched the description from the missing persons report?" Sarah nodded, though certainty felt like a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The height was right, the build, the way he moved, but the beard... She touched her own face unconsciously. "It changes things, makes you look different. People grow beards, Mrs. Chen, especially when they're trying to stay off the grid." Through the window behind Martinez, Sarah could see the main street of Millbrook settling into its evening rhythm. The hardware store was closing, old Mr. Peterson locking up with the same methodical precision he'd used for 30 years. Everything looked normal, but normal felt like a mask now, something thin and fragile that could slip at any moment. "Has anyone spoken to Thomas about this?" she asked. Martinez's pen paused mid-sentence. "We've attempted to locate Mr. Gray for questioning. He doesn't appear to be at his residence." The coffee turned bitter in Sarah's mouth. "What do you mean, doesn't appear to be?" "His truck's gone. House is locked up tight. Could be he went out of town for a few days." Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Or could be he heard about our interest and decided to take a little vacation." Sarah felt the baby shift inside her, a flutter of movement that reminded her of everything she had to lose, the weight of her decision to come forward, pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Thomas had helped her when no one else would, had shown her kindness when she desperately needed it, and now she'd potentially destroyed his life based on a glimpse of a face that might have belonged to someone else entirely. "I should go," she said, starting to rise. Mrs. Chen Martinez's voice stopped her. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He set down his pen and folded his hands on the desk. "In all your interactions with Thomas Gray, did you ever feel threatened? Did he ever make you uncomfortable?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah thought about Thomas's gentle hands helping her to her feet in the grocery store, the way he'd stepped back immediately to give her space. She remembered his voice, quiet and careful, never pushing, never demanding. The breakfast he'd made without asking for anything in return, the way he'd looked at her when she'd broken down about David, not with pity or judgment, but with understanding. "No," she said firmly, "never." Martinez nodded, making another note. "And you never got the sense that he was hiding something, that maybe he wasn't who he claimed to be?" This time Sarah hesitated, because the honest answer was more complicated. Thomas had always felt like a man with secrets, but not the dangerous kind, more like someone carrying old wounds, old sorrows that he didn't know how to share. She'd recognized it because she carried similar burdens herself. "Everyone's hiding something in a town this size," she said finally. "Doesn't make them criminals." A knock on the door interrupted them. Another deputy poked his head in, motioning for Martinez to step outside. Sarah was left alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the growing weight of her doubt. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the face she'd seen at the gas station, but memory was proving unreliable. Features shifted and blurred, certainty dissolving like sugar in water. When Martinez returned, his expression had changed. Something harder had settled around his eyes, a professional distance that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Chen, we're going to need you to stay available for the next few days. Don't leave town without letting us know." "Why? What's happened?" "We've been in contact with the FBI regarding the missing person case. Thomas Gray, or the man calling himself Thomas Gray, has become a person of significant interest in their investigation." The words hit Sarah like cold water. "What does that mean?" "It means," Martinez said, standing and walking to the window, "that your identification might have just helped us locate someone who's been missing for a very long time. Someone who disappeared under circumstances that were anything but voluntary." Sarah stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. They weren't just looking for a missing person anymore. They were looking for a man who might have been running from something far worse than she'd imagined. And she had no idea whether Thomas was the victim or the reason someone had disappeared in the first place. The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed overhead as Sarah sat in the hard plastic chair, her hands trembling around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Detective Morrison had been gentle but persistent with his questions, and now she found herself staring at a manila folder thick with photographs and documents spread across the metal table between them. "I need you to look at these again, Sarah," Morrison said softly. "Take your time." The photographs showed faces she recognized from around town. The mailman who always waved, the woman who worked at the bank, even Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop. But in these images, they looked different. professional, cold. The accompanying documents revealed identities that made her stomach churn. "How long have they been watching me?" she whispered. "We believe since you moved to town, maybe longer." Morrison pulled out another photograph, this one showing her old apartment in the city. "Your ex-husband has connections we're still uncovering, people who owed him favors, people who were afraid of what he knew." Sarah's baby kicked hard, as if responding to her surge of panic. She pressed her hand to her belly, trying to steady her breathing. "And Gabriel? How did he know?" "That's where it gets complicated." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Gabriel Reeves isn't his real name. His actual identity is classified, but I can tell you he used to work for a federal agency that specialized in witness protection. When he retired, or disappeared, depending on who you ask, he took certain skills with him. The room felt like it was spinning. He's been lying to me." "Not exactly." Morrison's expression softened. "According to our files, he's been protecting people like you for years, unofficially. People who fell through the cracks of the system." Before Sarah could respond, the station door burst open. Gabriel walked in, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something urgent and dangerous. His eyes found hers immediately, and she saw relief flood his face. "We need to move her, now." He addressed Morrison directly, ignoring the other officers who had stepped forward at his entrance. "Gabriel, she's safe here." "No, she's not." Gabriel's voice was sharp. "Davis has a contact inside the county system. They know she's here." Morrison swore under his breath and reached for his radio. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Sarah stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Stop. All of you, just stop." Her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "I'm tired of being moved around like a chess piece. I'm tired of people making decisions about my life without telling me what's happening." Gabriel took a step toward her, his hands raised peacefully. "Sarah, I know you're angry." "Angry doesn't begin to cover it." She faced him squarely. "You let me think you were just some kind hermit who happened to be in the right place at the right time. You let me trust you while lying about who you are. I never lied about caring for you." The words hung in the air between them. Morrison cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "I'll give you 2 a minute, but then we really do need to go." When they were alone, Gabriel's shoulders sagged slightly. "My real name is Gabriel Martinez. I worked for the U.S. Marshals Service for 15 years, specializing in high-risk relocations. I've seen what people like your ex-husband can do, how far their reach extends." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the moment you knew the truth, everything would change. You'd start looking over your shoulder constantly, questioning every person you met, every kindness offered. I wanted you to have some peace, even if it was temporary." Sarah studied his face, searching for any hint of deception. Instead, she saw exhaustion and something that looked like grief. "What happened to you? Why did you leave the marshals?" Gabriel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I failed to protect someone. A woman not much older than you. She trusted me to keep her safe, and I let my guard down. She died because I thought I was better at this than I actually was. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. That's why you're here. In this town, living alone. I came here to disappear. But then you walked into Peterson's store, and I saw something I recognized. Terror. The kind that follows you even when you think you're safe." He stepped closer. "I couldn't walk away. Not again." Outside, car doors slammed, and Morrison's voice carried through the thin walls as he barked orders. Gabriel's expression sharpened. "Sarah, I know you don't owe me your trust, but right now I'm asking you to let me do what I should have done 3 years ago. Let me keep you and your baby safe." She looked at this man who had already saved her once, whose own pain was written in the lines around his eyes. The baby moved again, and she made her choice. "What do we do?" The sheriff's office felt smaller than usual as Marcus stared at the photographs spread across the desk. 3 missing persons cases from neighboring counties, all within the past 18 months. All young women, all last seen near truck stops or gas stations along the interstate that ran just north of town. The state police think there might be a connection, Sheriff Donovan said, his voice carefully neutral. They're sending someone down tomorrow to coordinate. Marcus picked up one of the photos, a girl who couldn't have been more than 20, with Sarah's same hopeful smile. You think our guy from the store might be involved? I think we need to find him before anyone else gets hurt. Donovan pulled out another file. Got the surveillance footage from the grocery store finally. Want to take a look? They huddled around the small monitor as grainy black and white images flickered to life. There was Sarah, clearly distressed, items falling from her basket. Then a figure approached, tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The camera angle made it impossible to see his face clearly, but his movements were deliberate, careful. He knows where the cameras are, Marcus observed. Yeah, and watch this. Donovan fast-forwarded to the moment the man helped Sarah outside. See how he keeps his back to the main camera? This isn't amateur hour. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Sarah had been alone with this man, vulnerable and trusting. Have you shown this to her? Planning to. But Marcus... Donovan paused the video. There's something else. We ran the partial plate from the truck, came back to a vehicle reported stolen 3 weeks ago from a rest stop in Georgia. The pieces were forming a picture Marcus didn't want to see. A predator who moved carefully, deliberately, using stolen vehicles and avoiding cameras. Someone who knew how to spot vulnerability and exploit it. We need to put Sarah somewhere safe, Marcus said, already working on it. But she's refusing protection, says she can't live in fear, especially with the baby coming. Marcus understood Sarah's position, but it didn't make him feel any better. He'd seen too much in his years as a deputy to believe that good intentions were enough to keep someone safe. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. She seems nice. Your friend Sarah. Pretty too. Marcus showed the screen to Donovan, whose face went pale. How did he get your number? Same way he knew which truck stops to hit. Same way he knew where the cameras were. Marcus was already heading for the door. This isn't random. He's been watching us. They drove to Sarah's apartment, with lights flashing but no siren, not wanting to cause panic. Marcus called ahead, but Sarah didn't answer. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, his hands were shaking. Sarah's car was in its usual spot, no signs of disturbance, but when they reached her door, they found it slightly ajar. Sarah? Marcus called, drawing his weapon. Donovan flanked the other side of the doorframe. Marcus? Is that you? Sarah's voice came from inside, shaky but alive. They found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with something in her lap. As they got closer, Marcus saw it was a manila envelope. He was here, she said quietly. I came home from the doctor, and this was on my coffee table. The door was locked. I don't know how he got in. Donovan carefully took the envelope, using a handkerchief to avoid contaminating potential fingerprints. Inside were more photographs, not of missing women this time, but of Sarah. Pictures taken from outside her apartment, outside the doctor's office, in the grocery store parking lot. A dozen different angles, different days. Proof that she'd been watched for weeks. At the bottom of the stack was a note written in block letters, you shouldn't have involved the police. Now things get complicated. Sarah was trembling. I don't understand. What does he want from me? Marcus sat beside her, careful not to touch the evidence, but close enough to offer comfort. We're going to figure this out. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. The safe house in Millfield, Donovan said. It's 20 minutes away, secure location. What about my job? My doctor's appointments? I can't just disappear. Sarah, this man has been inside your home. He's been watching you for weeks. This isn't about the baby anymore. This is about keeping you alive. As if summoned by his words, Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another text. Safe houses aren't as safe as you think, but don't worry. When I'm ready, you'll know. The three of them stared at the phone in silence. Outside, the sun was setting, and the shadows in Sarah's apartment grew longer. Somewhere out there, a predator was watching, waiting, and planning his next move. and they were running out of time to stop him. The basement of Miller's Hardware smelled of oil and rust, familiar scents that usually comforted Daniel but tonight felt suffocating. He sat at his workbench, hands trembling as he dismantled the radio he'd been repairing for Mrs. Chen. The delicate components blurred before his eyes as Sarah's words echoed in his mind. What happened to Anna Reeves? He'd managed to deflect her questions earlier, but he knew Sarah wouldn't let it go. She was too smart, too determined, just like Anna had been. The screwdriver slipped from his grip, clattering against the concrete floor. Daniel pressed his palms against his temples, trying to push away the memories that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. 23 years of careful silence, and now it was all unraveling because he'd chosen to help a pregnant woman in a grocery store. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Time to finish what we started. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Only 3 people knew what had really happened that night, and he assumed the others would want the truth buried as much as he did. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Upstairs, heavy footsteps crossed his front porch. Daniel killed the basement lights and climbed the stairs slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Morrison's silhouette against the porch light. "Evening, Daniel." Morrison's voice carried through the door, artificially casual. "Mind if I come in?" Daniel's hand hovered over the deadbolt. Morrison had been a deputy back then, young and ambitious. He'd been the one to file the missing person report, the one who'd organized the search parties that combed the woods for weeks. He'd also been the one to quietly close the case when the trail went cold. "It's late, Tom. I know. But we need to talk." Daniel unlocked the door and stepped back as Morrison entered, his bulk filling the narrow hallway. The sheriff's uniform was wrinkled, his badge slightly askew. He looked like a man who'd been drinking. "Sarah Chen came to see me today," Morrison said, settling heavily into Daniel's kitchen chair. "Asking questions about Anna Reeves." "What did you tell her?" "Same thing I told everyone else 23 years ago. Anna left town. End of story." Morrison's eyes were bloodshot but alert. "Problem is, Sarah's not buying it. She's got documents, Daniel. Property transfers, bank records. She's putting pieces together." Daniel poured himself a glass of water with steady hands, though his insides churned. "What kind of pieces?" "The kind that point to murder." The word hung between them like a blade. Daniel had never allowed himself to think it, had spent more than 2 decades convincing himself that what happened that night was an accident, a tragic miscommunication that spiraled out of control. "She knows about the mine," Morrison continued, "knows about the development deal Anna was fighting. She's asking why a woman who was winning her case would suddenly disappear. Maybe because she wasn't winning." The voice came from the doorway, and both men turned to see Judge Harrison stepping into the kitchen. Even at 72, Harrison commanded attention, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the late hour. Maybe because she discovered something that would have destroyed more than just a development deal. Daniel's mouth went dry. 23 years ago, Harrison had been the town's district attorney, the man who'd convinced the state to drop their investigation into Anna's disappearance. The man who'd ensured that certain evidence never made it into the official record. "What are you doing here, Richard?" Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon. "The same thing you are. Damage control." Harrison pulled out the 4th kitchen chair and sat down, completing a triangle that felt more like a trap, though I suspect our definitions of that term might differ. Daniel looked between the 2 men who had shaped his life's biggest secret, Morrison, who'd buried the investigation, Harrison, who'd made it politically expedient to do so, and himself, the only one who knew exactly where Anna Reeves was buried. "Sarah's pregnancy is complicating things," Harrison said conversationally. "Public sympathy is a powerful force. If she starts making accusations, people will listen." "Are you threatening a pregnant woman?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Harrison's smile was thin as paper. "I'm stating facts. Sarah Chen has made herself a liability. Liabilities need to be managed." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "What are you suggesting?" I'm suggesting that some secrets are worth protecting, even now." Harrison's gaze settled on Daniel. "You've been quiet for 23 years. I trust you'll continue to be." It wasn't a request. Daniel understood that much, just as he understood that the text message hadn't come from Morrison or Harrison. Someone else knew the truth about Anna Reeves, someone who wanted it exposed, and Sarah Chen was caught in the middle. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning Main Street into a mirror that reflected the grey sky above. Sarah sat in her kitchen, watching the water cascade down her window while absently rubbing her belly. The baby had been restless all morning, as if sensing the tension that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. Marcus hadn't spoken to her since their argument about leaving town. He'd spent the last 2 nights in the guest room, emerging only for coffee and wordless exits to work. The silence between them felt more dangerous than any shouting match they'd ever had. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen table. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah hesitated before answering. Every conversation with her friend now felt like walking through a minefield. "We need to talk," Elena said without preamble. "Can you meet me at the diner?" "Elena, I don't think—" "Please, Sarah, it's about Thomas. There are things you need to know before it's too late." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone. She grabbed her coat and keys, not bothering to leave a note for Marcus. He probably wouldn't notice she was gone anyway. The diner was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing coffee and avoiding eye contact. Elena sat in the back booth, her usually perfect composure cracked around the edges. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she lifted her cup. "You look terrible," Sarah said, sliding into the opposite seat. "I haven't been sleeping." Elena's voice was hoarse. "David's been asking questions. About that night, about Thomas." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What kind of questions?" "He knows Thomas didn't just stumble onto what happened at the factory. Someone told him where to look." Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice. "He thinks it was me. Was it?" The question hung between them like a blade. Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I was 16, Sarah. My father worked at that plant for 20 years. When the cancer started, when the bills piled up, when we lost everything, I thought if I could just find proof, maybe we could get some justice, some compensation." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "I spent months going through Dad's old papers, talking to other families who'd lost someone. And then Thomas started coming around." Sarah's heart was racing. "Elena, what did you do?" "I gave him copies of everything. Medical records, employment documents, internal memos my father had kept. I thought he was going to help expose what David's family had covered up." Her voice broke. "I didn't know about his daughter. I didn't know what it would drive him to do." The weight of revelation settled over Sarah like cold water. "You're saying Thomas didn't just happen to know about the cover-up. You handed him the ammunition." "I was a kid who'd lost her father and wanted someone to pay. I didn't think about the consequences." Elena reached across the table, grasping Sarah's hand. "But now David knows, and he's not going to let Thomas destroy his family's legacy, pregnant woman or not." Sarah pulled her hand away. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're in danger, both of you. David's been making calls, Sarah. The kind of calls that make problems disappear." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "You need to leave town. Tonight. This is insane. David wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what? Protect his empire, his reputation?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "His family has been buying silence for 40 years. What's 2 more lives if it keeps their secrets buried?" Sarah felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her spiking adrenaline. "Even if what you're saying is true, I can't just disappear. This is my life, my home. Your life won't matter if you're dead." The bluntness of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about Marcus, about their silent house, about the way he'd been pulling away since Thomas entered their lives. Was it just anger, or was it fear? "There's something else," Elena said quietly. "The night you broke down in the store? That wasn't coincidence. David had been watching you for weeks, trying to figure out how much you knew about Thomas's investigation. When you had your episode, he thought you might be more vulnerable, more likely to trust someone offering help. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Are you saying David orchestrated that somehow? I'm saying he made sure Thomas would be there when you needed someone, made sure you'd see him as a hero instead of a threat. Elena stood up, throwing money on the table. Thomas may have saved you that day, but it wasn't fate, Sarah. It was manipulation, and now you're caught in the middle of a war you never asked to fight. As Elena walked away, Sarah sat frozen in the booth, rain drumming against the windows, like fingers tapping impatiently. The baby moved restlessly inside her, and she wondered if they were both running out of time. The rain hammered against the windows of the police station as Sarah stared at the evidence board Detective Morrison had assembled. Photos, timeline markers, and red string-connected dots she'd never imagined could be related. Her hands trembled as she traced the connections with her eyes. Marcus's arrival in town, the timing of certain business deals, the convenient accidents that had befallen anyone who asked too many questions. The pharmacy records show unusual orders of certain medications, Morrison explained, pointing to a cluster of documents. Medications that, when combined, could easily simulate heart attacks or strokes. Your husband wasn't the first, Sarah. He was just the most recent. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. But why? Why would they target David? Your husband was an accountant. He had access to financial records that could expose years of carefully orchestrated insurance fraud, land speculation, and worse. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. Someone realized he was getting too close to the truth. Marcus stood by the window, his usual calm demeanor shadowed with something darker. I should have acted sooner, he said quietly. I've been watching, gathering evidence, but I thought I had more time. Sarah turned to face him fully for the first time since entering the station. Who are you, really? And don't give me another vague answer about helping people. He was silent for a long moment. The only sound the steady drumbeat of rain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. Federal investigator, officially retired. Unofficially, I specialize in cases like this. Small towns where corruption has grown like cancer, protected by isolation and the assumption that no one important is watching. Your own family, Morrison added softly. Tell her about your family, Marcus. Marcus's jaw tightened. My daughter lived in a town like this, asked the wrong questions about some missing funds at the school where she taught. They made it look like a car accident, but the brake lines had been cut. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. I've been hunting the people responsible for 3 years. The trail led me here. The room fell silent except for the rain. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The same people who killed David? Part of the same network. These operations are more common than you'd think. Small, isolated communities where a few key people can control everything from property sales to local law enforcement to medical records. They identify targets, eliminate them quietly, and profit from the chaos left behind. Morrison spread out another set of documents. Insurance payouts, property acquisitions, business partnerships, it's all here. And your husband stumbled onto it while reviewing accounts for what he thought was a routine audit. Sarah's mind raced back through the last months of David's life. His late nights at the office, his growing anxiety, the way he'd started double-checking locks and looking over his shoulder. He knew, she whispered. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't tell me. He was trying to protect you, Marcus said, and he almost succeeded in exposing them. The evidence he compiled is what we needed to make the case, but he hid it too well. We've been searching for months. Where is it? Marcus exchanged a look with Morrison. We think he gave it to someone for safekeeping, someone he trusted completely, but who might not even know what they have. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah gasped. The sensation was different, sharper, more urgent. She looked down to see a small wet spot spreading across her pants. Sarah Morrison was at her side instantly. "I think—" Another contraction hit, unmistakable this time. "I think the baby's coming." Marcus was already moving toward the door. "Hospital. Now." "Wait." Sarah grabbed his arm, surprising herself with her strength. "The evidence. David's evidence. I think I know where it is." "The music box," she gasped. "David gave me a music box for my birthday, right before he died. Said it was special, that I should keep it safe always. I thought he just meant sentimentally, but—" Another contraction doubled her over. Morrison was calling for an ambulance, but Marcus knelt beside her chair. "Sarah, this is important. Where is the music box now?" "Home," she managed between breaths. "Bedroom dresser. But Marcus, if they killed David for this, if they know—" "They're going to come for you," he finished grimly. "Especially once they realize the baby's born, and you might start going through David's things more carefully." The ambulance sirens were getting closer, but Sarah could see in Marcus's eyes that time was running out faster than any of them had realized. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus stepped through the heavy oak doors, his weathered hands clutching a manila envelope that seemed to contain the weight of the world. Sarah gripped Tom's hand tighter, watching as the man who had become their unlikely guardian angel made his way to the witness stand with measured steps. Judge Patricia Henley looked up from her papers, her stern expression softening slightly as she recognized the familiar figure. Marcus had been a fixture in Cedar Falls for decades, though few truly knew his story. Today, that was about to change. "State your full name for the record," the court clerk requested. "Marcus James Thornfield," he replied, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom with surprising strength. Sarah's breath caught. She had never known his last name before this moment. Thornfield. It sounded important, weighty, like something from another era entirely. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman from the county seat, stood first. "Mr. Thornfield, you've been living in Cedar Falls for approximately 15 years, is that correct?" 16 years, 3 months, Marcus replied with precision. "And what is your profession?" Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the packed courtroom before settling on Sarah's face. "I'm retired. Previously, I worked in law enforcement." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sarah felt Tom's hand tighten around hers. Law enforcement? The quiet man who fixed her porch and brought them groceries had been a police officer? "What level of law enforcement, Mr. Thornfield?" "Federal. FBI. 28 years of service." The murmur became a wave of whispered conversations that Judge Henley quickly silenced with her gavel. Sarah stared at Marcus, trying to reconcile this revelation with the gentle man who had held her hand in the grocery store that day, who had shown up at her door when she needed help most. The defense attorney, a young man clearly out of his depth in this small-town drama, objected weakly before being overruled. The prosecutor continued. "During your time with the Bureau, did you specialize in any particular type of investigation? Financial crimes, white-collar criminal enterprises, money laundering operations?" Marcus's eyes shifted toward the defendant's table, where Mayor Davidson sat between his lawyers, his face pale and drawn. "And Mr. Thornfield, what initially drew your attention to activities here in Cedar Falls?" Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age and use. 3 years ago, I noticed irregularities in local development projects, permits being fast-tracked without proper oversight, construction contracts awarded to companies with no apparent local ties or competitive bidding process. Sarah remembered the conversations she'd overheard at the diner, complaints from long-time residents about how quickly certain projects moved through approval, while others languished for years. She'd never thought much of it then. "Did you investigate these irregularities?" "Informally, yes. Old habits." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's weathered face. "I discovered a pattern of kickbacks and fraudulent billing that traces back nearly a decade. Municipal funds diverted through shell companies, inflated construction costs, falsified inspection reports." The prosecutor approached the witness stand. "Mr. Thornfield, in your professional opinion, How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, $2.4 million over 8 years. The courtroom erupted. Judge Henley's gavel worked overtime as she called for order. Sarah felt dizzy, not from pregnancy this time, but from the magnitude of what she was hearing. Marcus had uncovered a massive corruption scheme that had been bleeding their small town dry. Mayor Davidson's head attorney stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Thornfield's calculations are based on unauthorized investigations with no legal standing." "Overruled," Judge Henley said firmly. "Mr. Thornfield's expertise in financial crimes investigation is well established." Marcus opened the manila envelope and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "I've prepared a comprehensive report detailing my findings. Transaction records, shell company formations, suspicious contract awards, all cross-referenced with the defendant's financial records and communications." The prosecutor accepted the documents with barely concealed satisfaction. "Your Honor, we request these documents be admitted as evidence." As the legal proceedings continued around her, Sarah found herself studying Marcus with new eyes. This man who had appeared in her life during her darkest moment, who had seemed like nothing more than a kind neighbor, had actually been conducting a complex investigation that would reshape their entire community. When Marcus finally stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly. The same gentle nod he'd given her that first day in the grocery store, when her world had felt like it was crumbling around her. She understood now that he had been protecting more than just her family. He had been protecting all of them. As court recessed for lunch, Sarah watched Marcus slip quietly through the crowd, declining reporters' shouted questions with the same humble grace he'd shown when she'd tried to thank him for fixing her porch. Some heroes, she realized, wore badges and solved cases that made headlines. Others carried groceries and asked for nothing in return. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town felt like a tomb in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah clutched Michael's hand as they followed Detective Morrison through the maze of rusted machinery and forgotten dreams. Their footsteps echoed against concrete walls that had witnessed decades of secrets. "Are you certain about this?" Morrison whispered, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Once we start, there's no going back." Michael squeezed Sarah's fingers. In the past week, everything they thought they knew about their quiet town had crumbled. The man who'd helped Sarah in the grocery store, gentle, mysterious Thomas, wasn't just a good Samaritan. He was a former federal agent who'd been tracking a human trafficking ring that had somehow embedded itself in the heart of their community. "We're sure," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The baby kicked as if responding to her mother's resolve. They moved deeper into the warehouse, following the map Thomas had drawn before disappearing 3 days ago. The plan was supposed to be simple: gather evidence, call for backup, wait for the cavalry. But Thomas had vanished, and Morrison received word that the operation was moving tonight. Their last chance before the ring relocated. "There," Morrison breathed, pointing to a section of the warehouse where light leaked beneath a false wall. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Behind that wall were answers to questions she'd never thought to ask. Why certain families in town lived in inexplicable poverty while others prospered without obvious means. Why some teenagers simply vanished, their disappearances explained away as runaways. Why Thomas had been watching, waiting, documenting. Morrison positioned herself beside the concealed door, hand on her weapon. Michael pulled Sarah back, but she resisted. "I need to see," she whispered. Thomas risked everything to expose this. "I won't hide now." The detective's radio crackled softly. Backup was still 20 minutes away. Too long. Through the thin walls they could hear voices, movement, the sound of vehicles approaching. Whatever was happening tonight was already in motion. Morrison made her decision. She pushed through the hidden door with Sarah and Michael close behind. The space beyond stole Sarah's breath. What had once been a loading dock had been converted into a staging area. Maps covered makeshift tables showing routes through 3 states, Boxes of identification documents sat stacked beside equipment Sarah couldn't identify. And in the center of it all, Mayor Hendricks stood over Thomas's motionless form. "Well," Hendricks said without turning around, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Sarah's world tilted. The mayor, the man who delivered speeches at school graduations and ribbon cuttings, was the center of the web Thomas had spent months unraveling. Morrison's weapon was already drawn, but Hendricks didn't seem concerned. "Detective Morrison," he continued conversationally, "I'm disappointed. Thomas here convinced you to abandon protocol, didn't he? Very unfortunate." "Step away from him," Morrison commanded, but her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. How deep did this conspiracy run? Who else in law enforcement might be involved? Thomas stirred, lifting his head with obvious effort. Blood matted his hair, but his eyes were alert. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible, "you shouldn't be here." "Nobody should be here," Hendricks replied. "But circumstances change, plans adapt." He gestured to the staging area around them. 5 years of careful work, Detective. 5 years of providing a valuable service while enriching our community. Do you have any idea how much federal money has flowed through this town because of our cooperation?" Sarah felt sick. The new community center, the upgraded school, the mysteriously well-funded social programs, all of it paid for with human misery. "It's over," Morrison said, though backup was still minutes away and the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. "Thomas documented everything. The evidence is already—" "Evidence can disappear," Hendricks interrupted. "Witnesses can be discredited. Small-town tragedies happen every day." But Thomas was moving, slowly positioning himself despite his injuries. Sarah realized he wasn't as helpless as he appeared. Years of federal training didn't vanish, even after a beating. "Actually," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength, "the evidence is already uploaded. Automatic trigger if I don't check in. Your operation died the moment you grabbed me." The mayor's composure cracked for the first time. "You're bluffing. Try me." Sarah felt the baby kick again, a reminder of the future she was fighting for. In that moment, she understood why Thomas had risked everything. Some secrets were too poisonous to keep buried. Morrison's radio crackled. Backup was close now. Vehicle doors slammed outside the warehouse, but Hendricks was already moving toward another exit, his empire crumbling around him. "Let him run," Thomas said, accepting Morrison's help to stand. "There's nowhere left to hide." As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Their quiet town would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. Sometimes you had to tear down the facade to rebuild something real. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew as Sarah climbed them one final time, her hand instinctively protecting her growing belly. 3 weeks had passed since the night everything unraveled, and the small town of Cedar Falls buzzed with an energy she'd never felt before. Where once there had been whispered secrets and careful silences, now there was something that felt remarkably like hope. Thomas walked beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. The man who had once seemed like the town's greatest mystery had become its unlikely catalyst for change. His quiet strength had given others the courage to speak truths that had been buried for far too long. Inside the courthouse, the hearing was already underway. District Attorney Helen Morrison, brought in from the state capitol, sat at the prosecution table with a stack of files that represented years of buried evidence. Across from her, 3 defense attorneys shuffled papers nervously as their clients faced charges ranging from embezzlement to conspiracy to obstruct justice. Sheriff Bradley sat in the defendant's section, his uniform replaced by an ill-fitting suit. The man who had once commanded respect through fear now looked diminished, his eyes avoiding the gallery packed with townspeople he'd spent years intimidating into silence. Beside him, Mayor Carruthers stared straight ahead, his political career reduced to ashes, while City Treasurer Margaret Hoffman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. Sarah found a seat in the middle of the courtroom, close enough to hear everything but far enough back to avoid drawing attention. Thomas settled beside her, and she felt some of her tension ease. These past weeks had taught her that sometimes the most profound changes came not from grand gestures, but from ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. The testimony had been devastating. Elena Rodriguez, the grocery store owner, had presented financial records that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption. For years, city contracts had been awarded to shell companies that existed only on paper, with the money flowing back to the very officials meant to oversee them. The new library that was never built, the road repairs that were paid for but never completed, the community center that existed only in budget line items, all of it documented with Elena's meticulous attention to detail. Dr. Patricia Wells had testified about the pressure she'd faced to overlook certain medical findings, particularly when they involved families with connections to City Hall. Her voice had cracked when she spoke about the reports she'd been forced to modify, the recommendations she'd been told to soften, the way her medical integrity had been slowly eroded by a system that valued silence over truth. But it was Mrs. Henderson's testimony that had truly shaken the courtroom. The elderly woman who ran the town's historical society had kept copies of everything, meeting minutes that had been altered, budget documents that showed unexplained transfers, correspondence that revealed the careful coordination of the conspiracy. Her house, with its rooms full of carefully organized files, had been the town's unofficial archive of corruption. "Your Honor," De Morrison was saying now, "what we've uncovered here goes beyond simple municipal corruption. This was a systematic betrayal of public trust that affected every aspect of life in Cedar Falls. These defendants didn't just steal money, they stole hope, opportunity, and the fundamental right of citizens to honest government." Sarah watched as the judge, brought in from outside the county to ensure impartiality, reviewed the evidence one final time. The silence in the courtroom was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of turning pages and the occasional nervous cough. Through the tall windows, she could see Main Street, where life was slowly returning to normal. The grocery store was busier than ever, as Elena had become something of a local hero. The diner had added a new lunch special called the Truth Teller, and Martha served it with obvious pride. Even the library, the real one that would finally be built with recovered funds, had broken ground just last week. Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand gently. In a few months, she would be bringing new life into this town, and for the first time since her breakdown in the grocery store, that prospect filled her with joy rather than fear. A child would grow up in a place where ordinary people had found the courage to demand better, where secrets didn't fester in darkness, where a quiet man's simple act of kindness could spark extraordinary change. The judge cleared his throat, and the courtroom fell completely silent. "In the matter of the state versus Bradley, Carruthers, and Hoffman," he began, his voice carrying the weight of justice too long delayed. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about that day in the grocery store when everything had seemed hopeless and her world was falling apart. She thought about Thomas stepping forward when he could have simply walked away, about Elena's gentle competence, about all the small acts of courage that had led to this moment. Sometimes the most ordinary moments really did reveal the most extraordinary people, and sometimes that was exactly what a town needed to find its way back to itself. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Elena's feet as she emerged into the morning sunlight, Marcus's hand steady in hers. Behind them, the heavy doors closed on a chapter that had defined their town for too long. Sheriff Brennan walked beside them, his uniform crisp but his face weary from the months of unraveling corruption that had stretched from City Hall to the state capitol. "It's really over," Elena whispered, placing her free hand on her rounded belly where their daughter moved restlessly, as if sensing the shift in the world around her. Marcus squeezed her fingers gently. "The legal part, yes, but the healing, that takes longer." Across the square, Elena could see the changes already taking root. The grocery store where this all began now bore a fresh coat of paint, its windows bright with handwritten signs advertising local produce from farms that were finally receiving fair contracts. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop waved from her doorway, no longer afraid to acknowledge Marcus in public. Dr. Reeves approached them, his medical bag in hand as always. "How are you feeling, Elena? Any contractions since yesterday?" She shook her head, smiling at the man who had become more than just her physician over these tumultuous months. "She's active, but patient. I think she's waiting for the right moment. Wise girl," he chuckled. "Takes after her parents." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The baby who had been the catalyst for exposing Mayor Davidson's corruption through the pregnancy assistance program that existed only on paper would soon be born into a town transformed by that revelation. Sheriff Brennan's radio crackled, and he stepped aside to answer it. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful. That was the state prosecutor. Davidson's plea deal went through, 15 years, and he's agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation into the agricultural subsidies scandal. Marcus nodded, his face impassive. Elena had learned to read the subtle emotions that flickered across his features. Relief, sadness, a complicated mix of justice and regret. He had never wanted to be the catalyst for such upheaval, but he had never shirked from what was necessary. "What about the others?" Elena asked. "Collins from the bank got 10 years. 3 city council members are facing charges, and the state's launching a full audit of rural assistance programs across the region." Brennan paused. "Your testimony made the difference, Marcus. Your documentation of the financial discrepancies, the pattern of denied applications, it gave them the framework they needed." Elena thought back to that day in the grocery store when everything had fallen apart, her carefully constructed life crumbling as publicly as possible. She had been so focused on hiding her struggles, on maintaining the appearance of having everything under control, that she had nearly missed the quiet kindness of a stranger who understood exactly what she was facing. "There's something else," Dr. Reeves said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "The new interim mayor asked me to give you this." Marcus opened it carefully, his eyebrows rising as he read. Elena leaned closer, scanning the official letterhead. "They're offering you the position of Director of Rural Development," she read aloud. "Marcus, this is unexpected," he finished, but she could see the spark of interest in his eyes. "You'd be overseeing the programs you helped expose, making sure they actually serve the people they're meant to help." Dr. Reeves smiled. "Seems fitting." Elena watched her husband consider the offer, knowing the weight it carried. For years, Marcus had worked in the shadows, using his skills and resources to help where he could while maintaining his anonymity. This would thrust him into the public eye permanently, make him a face of the town's renewal. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. She looked around the square, at the faces of neighbors who no longer looked away when they saw Marcus, at the small businesses beginning to thrive again, at the future taking shape around them. "I think our daughter should grow up in a place where kindness isn't revolutionary, where helping your neighbors is just what people do." Marcus folded the letter carefully. "Then I guess I have some calls to make." As they walked home through streets that felt different now, lighter somehow, despite everything they had endured, Elena marveled at how profoundly their lives had changed since that morning, when she had simply needed groceries and ended up finding so much more. Their daughter kicked strongly, and Elena laughed. "I think she approves. She'll grow up knowing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things," Marcus said. "That sometimes the most important changes begin with the simplest acts." The sun climbed higher over their small town, illuminating all the ordinary moments where extraordinary kindness waited to bloom. In the grocery store, in the doctor's office, in the simple gesture of one stranger reaching out to another when the world seemed to be falling apart. Sometimes, Elena thought, that was exactly how the world got put back together again.